Welcome everybody to the 19th Century Club. We're very happy to have you here today. My name is Deb Watson-Hammond and I am the Literature Chair and the Program Co-Director. We welcome you to the club where our mission is learning, giving, and sharing our landmark building. This is our last literature program of the year, and we're very pleased to have Catherine Jean Prendergast, an American literary scholar and professor of English down at U of I Champaign-Urbana. She and her husband drove up and we had a lot of fun talking at luncheon. She has a BA from Columbia, a PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and her research focuses on the intersection of social and literary cultural movements as well as the spread of English language. Her earlier book was very different from the book we're going to be talking about today. It was Literacy and Racial Justice, the Politics of Learning After Brown versus the Board of Education. That book won the Mina P. Shaughnessy Award from the Modern Language Associates. But today, we're going to be talking about something maybe a little more salacious than that, I should say. The author received a Guggenheim Fellowship for the book, which is called The Gilded Edge. It's narrative nonfiction, which investigates the circumstances ultimately resulting in the suicides of Nora Mae French, George Sterling, and his wife, Carrie Sterling, by cyanide ingestion.
By what?
So it's a true story of two women who easily could have been members of the 19th Century Club back in the day, a wife and a poet, and they learned the high price of sexual and artistic freedom in a vivid depiction of the debauchery of the late Gilded Age. So, Catherine Prendergast.
Thank you so much, Deb, and thank you all for coming. It's really an honor to be here where people want to hear more about the 19th century, you know? It's sadly not all the time, but thank you so much for the wonderful lunch, the warm welcome. Particularly, I've been corresponding with Deb and Becky and John Roberts, the videographer, to put this program together. It was really a pleasure to come up from Champaign and to see this beautiful building in this beautiful neighborhood. The title of my talk is The American Woman in the the New Woman in the American Imagination. And what is the new woman, you might ask? The new woman is essentially you, but 100 and some years ago. So on around 1890, women changed. And it was recognized. This is a typical depiction of the new woman. This one's from Puck's magazine in 1895. There you see the new woman and her bicycle. There will be several varieties of her. So you've got the new widow, the new washerwoman, and prominent is also the new Salvation Army lassies, okay? So with their tambourine. Up on the top in the picture, you have the old woman. She's on a chair because she's afraid of mice. And notice her very ornamented dress, right? The new woman is wearing bloomers better to ride on a bicycle. And this is typical of the imagination of the new woman. She is single. She is out there in the world. She's facing forward. She is on the move. She is fearless. And she is not to be closeted up and protected in the home like the old Victorian woman. So, it was not just a cartoon though. It was actually happening. This is a figure from John Singer Sargent, 1897, so right around the same time. Mr. and Mrs. I.N. Phelps Stokes, and you have to imagine she chose to pose in what was very common dress for the new woman, shirtwaist and long skirt. Special points for people who know the Chicago connection of Edith Stokes there. Anybody? Anybody? She was the model for your Republic Gold Woman statue in the Columbia Expedition of 1893. There she is. And her husband was an architect, and he was also a social reformer of the tenements, trying to get them cleaner air and such. So there she is. She is not, hanging on her husband. She is forward. She is in a more casual dress. And this was very much the movement at the time. If you want to ride a bicycle, play tennis, play golf, go to talks, etc., all the more easier to do in what they called rational dress. So typically, this is one of Gibson's, Charles David Gibson. Yes, I heard some. Yeah, we'll talk more about him in a minute. But there you go. You've got the skirt, you've got the shirtwaist, you've got the hat, and the whole idea of the rational dress movement is that nothing about your dress should impede your activity. Form should follow function. Okay, so there was less frills, less. There was a movement away from corsets. It wasn't entirely happening, but just less constraining undergarments, and in general, something that allowed simplicity yet grace. The feature, of course, was the shirtwaist, and these were the symbol of women of the era. This is a rather simple one. You could add some lace. You could have a pattern. Candy stripes were also common in these, but it's just tied right around here, and then they belt the skirt over it. They could be mass produced. So, here was an item that would not cost much for women to go buy, and that they might wear to work. For the first time, middle-class women are choosing sometimes to work outside the home, in offices, in anything that they could find employ in, rather than immigrant women who worked in the factories or in domestic labor. Now, if the name shirtwaist rings a bell, you might be thinking of the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, March 25th, 1911, where 146 women who made these shirtwaists, virtually, 80% of them were immigrant Jewish women who were born outside the country and had just moved to the Lower East Side, perished within a half an hour as some debris from the shirts caught fire, and there was locked doors, and as you can see, the fire ladders did not reach to the 7th and 8th and 9th floor where the offices of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory were, and they were not equipped to deal with this whatsoever. This spawned a lot of reform in factory sanitation, hygiene, and safety among the women who were working towards that even before the fire, and after were also new women. This is Rose Schneiderman on the left, Pauline Newman on the right, and Rose Schneiderman was in the Women's Trade Union League. They see the sign there. Pauline Newman was the first woman organizer of the International Ladies Garment Worker Union in New York, and they were, she was a strike organizer. Notice they are also wearing shirtwaists. That was but a very sort of simplified version. And Pauline Newman, who sometimes went by the name Paul, is wearing a very masculine cravat there on the front of it. But so there were numerous varieties of the new woman, indeed, but the most commodified, the one that is pictured, the one that you'll see in coffee table books and histories, is, of course, the Gibson Girl. The Gibson Girl was ravishing, usually single, had the updo just like that. She has this sort of knowing look where she just looks, just kind of down at you. She was equally comfortable at sport or going to the theater or going to dances. Here she is being asked by a gentleman, "Shall we talk or dance?" And she says back, "I'm so tired, let's dance." Now, this is not somebody sitting there waiting for the man to, finally notice me. She's a little bored about it. She's a little confrontational. And in fact, the new woman, almost immediately as she emerged, inspired concern. What happens if these women go out there in the world? What happens if they think about their lives beyond their homes? What happens if they have aspirations in the professional world or in, the arts or in charity? So very emblematic of the concern is this 1901 there's a whole series of them where we're suddenly worried that things are going to go a bit too far. Yeah. This lady is wearing the pants. She's got her bicycle right behind her. She's ready to go. Smoking a cigarette, wearing the shirtwaist, a little checked one in this case. And there's a husband basically wearing an apron that looks like a skirt, The new woman, wash day, right? And it is hilarious, except it's kind of not in the story I'm going to tell you, because one of the things that I noticed as I was doing my research is that I was seeing discussion of the new woman everywhere. But what I never saw was any mention of a new man. In fact, there wasn't even a term, the new man. That's how not new men were, okay? So there was a kind of expectation that once the new woman came along, that men would have to change, to accommodate this. That did not occur. You're shocked. So, the story I'm about to relate is what happens when the expectations that the era kind of gave women, that they could look for a kind of life outside the home. And the image they saw everywhere of women leading these lives outside the home meets something like the reality. And so I was sort of in this book popping the hood a bit to look at the inner lives of women during this time. There's two new women featured in my book, as Deb mentioned. One was married. She worked in an office for a while, Carrie Sterling up top. The other was Nora Mae French. And they met at Carmel by Sea in the midst of all this, and disaster resulted. The question is, was all three of these died of cyanide? Nora Mae French, 1907. Carrie Sterling, it's an older picture, it's really not fair to put her next to Nora, because she's younger right there, but 1914, and then George Sterling, Carrie's husband, in 1926 in the Bohemian Club of San Francisco, a very, very exclusive and powerful and still existing club, which count, people like Nixon among its members. One of the theories is that there was a cult among these people. They were bohemians, they were artists, and so the story was they carried cyanide on their person. So when the bloom of life faded, when the fun was gone, they could dispatch themselves. And so I was researching this, and what I found out was that actually there wasn't a cult. That story could only be traced to one person, even though it was told and retold. The actual story was in some ways far more disturbing. So here's George and Carrie Sterling. I love this photo because you can really see the new woman in Carrie. That she's tipped back, she's looking, at you from under her lids. She has the shirtwaist, she has the long skirt, and she is just one of the guys, hanging out. As it turns out, she had kind of a rough life. She grew up, her dad was a police captain in Oakland, and he died when she was still very young. Her mom took in boarders, had to move closer to the Oakland docks. And so she wound up kind of working in a boarding house as she was growing up. She took her first opportunity to get a job in San Francisco in an office, and she worked for a firm called the Realty Syndicate. The Realty Syndicate had bought up tons of East Bay area land. At that point, it was farms and whatnot, and they imagined wealthy communities, bedroom communities for San Francisco, elite. And the nephew of the guy who ran the firm was this man here, George Sterling. George Sterling was not from the West Coast. He was true Yankee blue blood. His, ancestors had settled Sag Harbor, over there at the end of the Hamptons, and Shelter Island. It was said that his great-great-grandfather had lanced more whales with his arm than anyone, right? So he had a big story. He was also, once he moved to the Bay Area, best friends with Jack London. And so that's Jack over on this side, and George. They love to party. This is at the Bohemian Club Grove, which is, they always had a 2-week drunk fest and theater festival every summer. Jack came from nothing, right? George at that point is pulling down $175 a week working for his uncle in the Realty Syndicate. So he got Jack London his first house for under market rates, and they were buddies from then on. Wolf and Greek was their nicknames. That's what they called each other. And George, who was Greek after Dante, because he wrote poetry, whereas Jack was more the short story writer, they drank and drank and drank and went to brothels together, and just anything Jack did, George did, buddies to the end. Now, this was a little hard, as you can imagine, on the wives, okay? And at one point, Carrie, early on, is getting a little tired of this. And Jack's wife has just, their marriage is just split up. And she's like, you gotta settle down. And he's like, really? George says, I think the problem is San Francisco, but I know a guy who's just bought this land on the Monterey Peninsula, and if we move there, I'm sure once I'm away from all the temptations of city life, I will stop drinking and stop going to brothels and settle down. And so Carrie goes, well, that sounds good. So they, has anybody, by the way, here been to Carmel by the Sea? Oh, wonderful. Most of you. A few adjectives, please, you can shout out. It's gorgeous, right? Yeah. It's just very what? Very, very pricey, right? Yeah, lots of restaurants, galleries, and I would say, I think I looked it up last, the median house there, and there's lots of cute little houses. They have all those fairy tale houses that they built in the 20s. I'm sorry, none of that was there when they went in 1905. It was a square mile of dirt, okay, abutting a beautiful ocean. It was 3 miles from Monterey. Right there, you can see Monterey. Monterey was already built up. It had the Hotel Del Monte. It was built by the Big Four Railroad Company and their Pacific Improvement Company. So they had an express train from San Francisco. You could come down for the weekend. You could stay in the Hotel Del Monte's 500-room sumptuous hotel with ornamental gardens and a bathhouse and a racetrack. And so this guy that George Sterling knew goes, Well, all I need to do is lure these folks just 3 miles away, and I will build the next wealthy resort, because the train is sure to extend, right? Did you get to Carmel by sea by train? No, you did not. The train never went there, okay? Instead, it was quite a struggle to bring people. And I'm going to read a little of my book here to describe Carrie's first impressions of Carmel, which they moved there in 1905. Carrie sat with George atop the Carmel stagecoach through 3 dusty, bumpy miles from the Monterey train station, wondering what kind of mistake she had made. The driver, a disgusting man who chewed and spat tobacco, continually egged the horse, Pet, up the steep hill. It took nearly an hour to reach the crest, whereupon Carrie was pitched sharply forward. She rearranged her hat as Pet plodded down the long slope to reach Carmel by the sea. When George took her hand to show her to their new address, she stumbled over a tree root, unable to see for the fog. Her husband led her to the back of the property, to the tent, where they would live while the bungalow was under construction. It was July 11th, 1905, and Carrie's life in Carmel had begun. She awoke to dense fog again on July 12th, fog again on July 13th. All through the next week, as the builders laid the foundation and began to put up the walls, and as Carrie struggled over a camp stove to provide them 3 daily meals, she could hardly see 10 feet in front of her face. George's diary of the weather, kept on a tiny lined notebook, had become distressingly repetitive. Fog all day, fog all day, fog all day. The sun came out in the first week of August, to their great joy. As they exited the tent, they were treated to views clear over the Carmel River to the hills beyond. They walked to the beach and sat together on the white sand, gazing at Carmel Bay, sapphire and dazzling. But then the sun disappeared once again, and Carrie was back at work, scrambling to keep the builders fed and their clothing washed. She had lost so much weight, she had at last achieved the Gibson girl willowy frame. Her white blouse, though frequently soiled, narrowed dramatically at her cinched waist. But was it worth it? Carmel was beginning to feel much like her life in Oakland, minus an oven, a sink, restaurants, theater, dress shops, and any of her friends. The only society was an assortment of earnest older women at the Arts and Crafts Club who hosted the occasional talk on dreary subjects for the elevation of the mind, she assumed. Mid-August, their friends arrived with the furniture. Carlton Bierce, that's Ambrose Bierce's nephew, and Jimmy Hopper unloaded chairs, tables, artwork, and other cherished possessions from the stagecoach and dumped them in a pile on the bare living room floor. George rolled up his sleeves to help. As the men arranged her furniture into a semblance of a living space, Carrie thought that surely domestic stability must be on the horizon. True, her best dishes were still in boxes. The windows took on all the dirt of the constant construction. But she forced herself to look on the bright side. At least she and George would have more time together. When a week later, George spent the evening down the street to help Mrs. Kaplansky, a so-called aspiring poet, Carrie sank to her knees in front of the unfinished chalkstone hearth and began to weep. In a town nearly devoid of women, devoid of any people even, George could still find a mistress. Yeah, so it didn't, somehow the geographical didn't cure everything, but George has a job there, okay? His job is to be the resident poet and to convince other people to move down. Now, what we don't realize, because this doesn't show the whole map of California, is that there was something of a land rush going at the time the railroad rush finished. Everybody thought, oh, the railroad would go here, the railroad would go there. So people are buying up plots of land to turn them into the next Monterey, okay? So he has to host these, like, think of it as a timeshare weekend when you go down there and somebody shows you a good time to sell you things. He would do this. He loved to be naked. I'm sorry, but I have so many photos of him naked. So he would pick them up at the Monterey train station, take them through the 17-mile drive, they would have lunch at beautiful Del Monte, then they would come down to Carmel, then he would take them to Point Lobos the next day, and he would perform his swim for abalone. And then they would all pound abalone on the beach, because you have to pound it for like an hour before you could put it on the grill, or it's too tough to eat. And they would make up songs, because they're artsy, and there would be things like, everyone would put a new verse. This is one. Some folks boast of quail on toast because they think it's Tony, but I'm content to owe my rent and live on abalone. So he would be saying this while he was simultaneously still the vice president of the second biggest land developer of the East Bay, with capitalization of several $1 million. It was all kind of a show, right? So, their job is to find the best writers to move there. Of course, who better than Jack London? Jack London had published in 1903, The Call of the Wild, which was an instant success. He was the first author to really, really make a ton of money. And, George had met him before that and kind of thought he'd nurtured his talent up, though he looked down upon Jack's work as those damn dog tales. But undisputably, at this point, Jack is the most famous American author. No two ways about it. And so they're trying to get him to move there. There's just one problem. George's wife, Carrie Sterling, hates Jack's new wife, hates her, because she broke up her marriage, Charmian in London. So she's just like, oh, I do not want that man around. But, they have no choice. Their job is to recruit. So Jack said, I'm actually moving to Sonoma. No problem. We'll just have a photographic shoot down here, and we'll pretend you live here, and we'll send that to all the papers. So this is a very famous picture of Carmel. It was taken by Arnold Genta, who took a lot of the photographs of the San Francisco earthquake, and we'll get to that in a minute. We have George Sterling and what I call his bohemian drag here. He's wearing these high socks, he's got his Greek fisherman's cap, or what have you, his fishing cap. We have Jimmy Hopper, who's a short story writer, friend of theirs. We have Jack. And we have Mary Austin, who's a writer from the American West, who was also, growing in fame at this point, and who did build in Carmel. Notice her garb, shirtwaist, and long skirt. But everybody's listening to Jack, okay? And if you see, you can see this photo numerous places, and it worked. Now, every time people mention Carmel, I see Jack London's name is right there. But here's a picture you don't see. This is Arnold Genta lining up the shop, right? Behind a log are the wives and children, sort of separated out, okay? Charmian London is right here, Carrie, there's a couple of other writers from Carmel, but they're separated out of the shot, don't need to know them. Mary's the only one who makes the cut. The other thing you don't see is sort of the effort that goes into these weekends, which was entirely on Carrie's shoulder. Essentially, she's running a boarding house again, okay? Because every weekend, they're trying to recruit people. Another shot that day, nobody sees. George, he's got the seltzer in one hand and the scotch in the other, right? He's all set for the picnic. He doesn't really need anything else. Everybody's listening to Jack again. Charmian London, sitting right next to Carrie, who's in front of the picnic basket getting food together. Jimmy, his wife, and 2 kids. And I can tell you right now, Carrie's in a terrible mood because she has heard the Londons having sex that morning. Charmian London, put this word lolly in her diary to indicate every time that she and Jack had consensual relations. So, you know, if you read her diary in the Huntington Library, you get a glimpse at their personal life that's probably closer than you really want to know. So not only has Carrie to entertain these two people that George promised she would never have to entertain, but it's going very badly for her. One of the guests that comes in a little later after this photo shoot is in November of 1906. The second woman is Nora Mae French. She's also a new woman. All of these women would be new women, considered that way, absolutely. Nora Mae French is quite different from Carrie, however. She is a poet through and through. She kind of writes like she breathes. She won a poetry contest at the age of 11. She had, work in the papers by the time she was a teenager. Charles Loomis, has anyone read the library book by Susan Orleans? Yes. So you might remember Charles Loomis. He's the librarian, and he is the central figure of Los Angeles Literary Society, seeks her out, and at age 17, she's publishing in his journal Out West, where the land is sunshine. She's also devastatingly beautiful. But whereas Carrie Sterling went from rags to riches, Nora Mae French went the other way. She is the great-grandniece of Henry Wells, the founder, over here, of American Express, Wells Fargo, including the Wells, Pony Express, and on her mother's side. And then on her father's side, she's the granddaughter of the 9th governor of Illinois, Augustus French, known for his thrift. Really, a governor of Illinois. So, I don't want to ruin the book by explaining how the French family, Nora Mae French, wind up in Los Angeles when they started out in Wells College under the umbrella of the Wells family and quickly fell into poverty. But by the time she's a teenager, her horizons are sharply limited, and she winds up working in a leather factory, making $5 a week, sewing leather mittens and boots. She loves the outdoors. This photo is taken of her. It kind of reminds me of, you remember the old Schweppes bottle? Yeah, that's what I think of, in the woods, and she would rather be outside than anywhere. She's got a problem being a woman and a poet. She is at some point expected, of course, to get married, and she fails absolutely to do that. She's had offers. She's engaged at one point. That falls apart because the man wants her to stop writing and start being domestic. And she says, you might as well try to talk she might as well try to talk a ragged robin into a pansy. It was just not going to happen. Instead, she moves to San Francisco after the earthquake to be with this man, Harry Lafler. Harry Lafler is sitting there typing post-earthquake in a square in front of the Hall of Justice. The earthquake is kind of like their 9/11. It is a generational event that changes everything, destroys most of San Francisco, and what the earthquake doesn't destroy, the fire does afterwards. Harry Lafler was the editor of a modest-sized literary journal at the time, who had accepted Nora's poetry, and they fall in love through the mail. And so it's all very adorable until he tries to edit her work. And he changes the word wind. Here I have to do a little auditory symbol. Wind, meaning wind with an I, versus wind with a Y. He changes it to a Y. And she goes, oh, no. And her next letter begins, Dear Critic. We will disagree violently on the subject of wind or wind. I know wind Wind is the approved version, but I don't know it personally. It isn't wind I love, but wind. Wind. A wind is something that crawls around moated granges and sends chills up Mariana's spine. A wind whips through the sagebrush and sings in the pines and tries to take you with it right off the top of the hill. She wrote, I will have wind with a short I. At this point, her poetry is getting known in journals broadly, even on the East Coast. But her relationship with Lafleur takes a turn. This is a letter where she is describing to Harry that she is pregnant. Yes. She says, very dear, I have been through deep waters and proved myself cowardly after all, for I have bought some strenuous drugs Friday night, took them Saturday, and am suffering delayed and welcome pains today. She wrote her way through it and spared him nothing. The rest of the letter, I mean, this is from an archivist, from a historian's point of view, remarkable. We don't have very many first-hand accounts like this. What we know is often through legislation or from doctors, etc. But if you were a 19th century woman and you found yourself in trouble, you would just pop down to the drugstore and buy you something like this. Chichester's Diamond Brand. It used to say pennyroyal, but eventually you couldn't say that. They were compounds that were generally had pennyroyal or tansy or some herbal remedy. They were often euphemistically advertised, but advertised everywhere, as helping women with their problems, or, etc., women's pains. And by 1908, they're getting harder to advertise because you've got the fellow named Comstock who is making, all sorts of, there's a great book called The Man Who Hated Women about that. But at the time that Nora was finding herself in trouble, this is 1906, 07, this still would have been like easy to find anywhere. Now, they were not always reliable. Also, they could kill you. There were often unadvertised ingredients like turpentine. And so, anytime you were doing this, you were taking a risk for your life as well. At any rate, she then breaks up with that Lafleur thing. I forgot to mention Lafleur's married. That's not even the start of it. He was quite a ladies' man as well. So she moves into Carmel. She loses her job at she was a hello girl, as they call it, at the telephone exchange. She loses her job there, and then she's without a boyfriend, without money, and she accepts the Sterling's invitation to move temporarily to Carmel. At this point, I'm going to not tell you much what happens while she's living with the Sterlings, because I don't want to ruin the book for you if you haven't read it. But what you already know is she dies. She dies at the age of 26 in 1907, I know, leaving so much poetry unwritten in the Sterling's house. And her death causes a national sensation. Here it is featured in the Oakland Examiner. This would be around November 15th, the day or so after she dies. Notice there's still this beautiful photo from Arnold Genta, that's rendered as a drawing. The entire Carmel set is discussed. There's Mrs. Austin up there. Remember Mary Austin from sitting there on the beach? She's looking at the clock. Here's a picture of George Sterling, etc. I won't discuss this because that'll be another spoiler, but at any rate, the headlines from coast to coast were quite something. This one is Midnight Lure of Death Leads Poetess to Grave. I saw other ones that were just simply Girl Writer Tires of Life. what I found incredible about all the coverage of her is that none of it mentioned she's the grandniece of Henry Wells or the granddaughter of the 9th governor of Illinois. And I'm wondering how that happens, right? They, of course, all knew who she was, but they left the families well out of it. So she dies just, as girl writer or poetess. And this is, by the way, November 15th, 1907. We are in the middle of a financial panic caused by the crash of securities. People overinvested. Charles Knickerbocker tried to corner the copper market and it didn't work out. So on or about October, half of Wall Street's value has just tanked. Nobody would be surprised to see a banker's name run through the mud, but somehow Henry Wells escapes notice. And this is where I like to leave us to reflect how women's lives are memorialized. George Sterling is memorialized by an entire park on Russian Hill in San Francisco. If you go up those stairs, and you get to the top, in what is prime real estate, there's a park named Sterling Park, named after him. There's a plaque. There's a bench that's made out of concrete and mosaic, right? That is quite a legacy for a man who was, in fact, have you ever heard of George Sterling as a poet? Anybody? 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 No, right? He was a terrible poet. And had it not been for Ambrose Bierce being his buddy, and on one side, Jack London being his buddy on the other side, it's questionable whether much of his stuff would have got published at all. But what he did have was a lot of rich friends. And at that point in San Francisco, the area that is now Sterling Park was a reservoir for the Spring Valley Water Company. And the Realty Syndicate was buying up water utilities. So they left this large legacy there. Nora Mae French, however, is buried in history. I was often asked as I was writing this book, why are you writing about these unknown women? And I'm sitting there looking at front pages of newspapers going, what unknown women? They weren't unknown at the time, but as I was researching, I found that Nora Mae French's name was often crossed out. There were letters that were ripped. These people burned their letters. They were very reputation savvy. And so she doesn't even have a file, an archive file in her name. I had to find it in Harry Lafleur and George Sterling and all this. What I concluded is that women's records, they're like, the archives for women are like graveyards where there's huge mausoleums for the men, but you have to dig to find these random bones of women that just happen to be in there. And that's what I'd like us to think about as we close here. What stories get remembered? What stories get told? Who makes a place for these stories to get told? There's this place here that's being made because we have an interest in the 19th century. But otherwise, I do worry that the people who get memorialized aren't memorialized for merit, but just often because they had the right friends at the right time. And I want us to think about this. If you know people, whose story that you think is worth telling, I hope I inspire you to take out a little recorder, and just get them talking. Get them talking. Because there are stories out there that nobody knows and that are incredible and speak of the depth of people's lives in a way many of these images that are left to us do not. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take questions.
Okay, if you have a question, raise your hand and I'll bring the microphone to you.
Or a comment.
Thank you. What was the term hello girl?
Oh, the hello girl was the switchboard operators. She worked for the telephone exchange. That was her job. And it was an incredibly difficult job. There was a lot of stress because the women who operated the switchboard could listen in on people's calls, and the fear was that they would be able to hear compromising material and then be able to extort powerful people in San Francisco. So there was a lot of supervision of them, and many of them actually did wind up killing themselves in sort of high-profile scenarios. But yeah, that was the Hello Girls.
What inspired you to do this research and write this book?
You know, I wasn't looking for this. I didn't set out thinking, I want to write about people who died of cyanide and why. No, I had gotten the Guggenheim grant to research writers' colonies and artist colonies. And what I had noticed was that a crop of them had started just at the beginning of the 20th century. The famous ones like Yaddo, McDowell, Carmel, Burncliffe, and Woodstock, all were founded within 7 years of each other, all by what I call second-tier robber barons. You know, people who had money, but they did not have like Carnegie Morgan money. Like they couldn't leave you an opera house or a museum. But what they could do was buy up some depressed real estate, you know, in somewhere and house artist colony. What was weird about Carmel and why it wound up being the book was two things. While Yaddo and McDowell were nonprofits and, you know, orgs, you know, much like this, Carmel actually was never intended to be an artist colony. It was a real estate scheme. It was a for-profit company that ran out of ideas of how to attract people. So thought, why don't we just get some artists here to write about it and paint about it and lure their friends? And that's what we'll do. You know, had the turkey trots or anything else they tried in the years before worked, they would have never had artists there to begin with. And one of the tough things about when I gave a talk about this at Carmel is present-day Carmel, as we discussed, beautiful, wealthy, but always very much mindful of their bohemian past and always thinking, like, how can we make the town more like our predecessors wanted it? So there are ordinances, for example, that forbid cutting down trees. High heels are forbidden. I would not be able to wear these in Carmel. Don't ask. Yeah, no vending machines outside. There's ordinances about where newspaper racks can go to preserve this. And what I had to tell them was, if you were worried about having become a wealthy resort, that's what you were supposed to be the whole time.
This is a wonderful presentation, thank you.
Thank you.
The women in those days who were wearing the shirtwaist dresses and were going out to work, not the ones that were in the factories, you know, but those that were looking for other jobs. What types of jobs were available for them?
Right, so Carrie was assistant to the bookkeeper. At that time, George Sterling was the bookkeeper. So it was office work. Her sister married his uncle, the guy who owned the whole thing. Okay, and so she had gotten the job first and got Carrie the position. So it was white-collar jobs. They were starting to work in white-collar jobs, right? And that was the beginning of that. But women, of course, were always working in domestic and factory labor, but they would have considered that, you know, immigrant labor for the Irish or the Jewish or the Italians. But, you know, this was something they could do that wasn't taking in boarders or, you know, the sort of quieter in-home work that if you weren't of means you would be doing. But you were, of course, you quit when you got married, as Carrie did. You know, it was a matter of you did this while you were single and then you moved on.
Any other questions or comments?
One hand down here.
I have always wondered how the immigrant class of women dressed, because I can't imagine my grandmother or my great-grandmother wearing stays, wearing those corsets.
Yeah. So I think Rose Schneiderman and Pauline Newman are more your, and frankly, my ancestors, kind. Then they would have not been wearing the corsets. They would have had to breathe while they were at the sewing machine for 8-9 hours, etc. So yeah, the Gibson girl shirtwaist thing is very stylized, like it's still got the corset there. But immigrant women, not so much. And my next book is about the Jewish women labor activists who, Pauline Newman had worked in the Triangle factory since she was 11, and child labor was supposed to be, illegal, but somehow they always knew when the inspector were coming, and they would take the kids in the quote-unquote kindergarten corner of the factory and have them jump into these vats of finished shirts, and they would put them over them so the inspector wouldn't know they were there. So that was very common. But yeah. And that's why, I'm very much interested in the gap between the images we get handed down through, sergeant paintings, which are a very small echelon of the women of the day, or through the Gibson girls, that's only one very stylized version of the new woman writ large.
Any more questions?
Come over here.
Hi, thank you. This is fascinating. Can you give us a little more perspective on what was happening before the 1890s? Why did this all culminate at this particular time? Did World War I enhance it or not, in your opinion?
That is an excellent historian's type question. So what was happening before this was money? Okay. The growth of the railroads and the concomitant growth of speculation on Wall Street. The entire mass of money was made largely through speculating on railroads, and people would put people out, try to get people to move to places just so they could rationalize a railroad, just so they could sell securities for that railroad. So there was a bubble that burst around 1893, which made this land readily available. And with the financial growth, if you think about Wall Street growing and securities, et cetera, you needed labor. And here women were, able to suddenly, stretch their legs a little and go out and take advantage of the economic possibilities that were now open to them because they were needed. The door kind of shut on that, starting around where women, get the vote. And World War I brings back sort of the value of men. And there's definitely a lot of blowback, particularly in the realm of reproductive rights. There's a lot more legislation on, how women's pregnancies go or don't go, etc. So there's and progressive laws that you lose your naturalization, you lose your citizenship if you marry an immigrant. That law. So they had ways of kind of corralling women a little bit after that, but women did get the vote out of it.
Thought I saw a question over here.
Portrayal of the Gibson girls. How was that spread? Was there a Gibson magazine or?
He was widely in magazines, all kinds of magazines, from Life, on, and also in advertisements. Eventually, of course, he put his own books together, collections. But if you think of it like, the New Yorker, those cartoonists who are featured, well, he would be one of those, an illustrator. And so, if you were a magazine, you would buy an illustration from Charles Dana Gibson. So it would be a very familiar figure. And one of his early models was Evelyn Nesbit. Do you remember her, the girl in the velvet swing, who had a little affair with Stanford White when she was a teenager and a dancer? And her later husband, Henry Thaw, shoots him at the roof of the Madison Square Garden. And that becomes a huge spectacle. And one of the reasons I talk about in the book that Nora Mae French is so featured is that the newspapers are then looking for who's the next girl who dies, in scandalous circumstances. We can forward to, sell magazines.
Well, thank you very much for coming. And if anyone's interested in the book, we have it for sale downstairs. If everybody would come downstairs for tea, you can ask any questions that you don't want to ask in the entire audience. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thanks for coming.